Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, Samo and I will be back with new episodes of Live Players later this week. Until then, please enjoy this conversation we recorded in 2019 covering many of Samo's core ideas about civilizations and institutions. We cover what a truly egalitarian society might look like, great founder theory, patronage in China, and technology's role as a centralizing force.
Samo, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be on the show.
So, Samo, you study, and your life's work is about why civilizations flourish, why they decay, and why there hasn't been an immortal society yet. Is that a fair analysis of your life's work? Or how would you add or edit to that? And why have you chosen that as your life's work?
I was going to say that societies have ended before. And I think it's a rather interesting observation that over the last 10,000 years of recorded history, we've had something like 12 identifiable dark ages just in Eurasia. This isn't counting things like the end of the Mayan civilization and the New World, where records are much more sparse and we only have, say, 1,500 years of history. All efforts that people put towards improving the world or the distant future or having an impact or becoming memorable have not only the natural lifespan of our own biological lives, but are efforts that are contained in and stand on this larger foundation of the society in which we find ourselves embedded. And many of our achievements are only legible within this society. So I find it interesting that for people of high ambition, where they tend to want to think about this very long-term legacy, there's so little thinking on this topic. So my question is, why aren't more people interested? Why aren't more people dedicating research and time and thought to this question?
And what's the main idea that you want people to know, or that you want to bring to the world that you think is understudied, underexplored, or underappreciated, or people just disagree with you about?
Basically, the broad infrastructure of society. I think that society is not automatic. I think it's fundamentally an artificial process that we've constructed to a significant degree. Our civilization relies on cornerstone institutions and various kinds of knowledge to persist into the indefinite future. These are not natural phenomena. Social engineering has been employed at every major reformation or transformation of society. Therefore, I think the appreciation for this infrastructure and also an understanding that we have to be intentional about its renewal rather than rely on society evolving in its own way. Society evolving in its own way is just the actions of other people transforming it. So I think the basic idea is a civilization as a collection of symbiotic institutions, and the institutions being these artificial constructs created by, long forgotten founders.
So back up for a second. You're of the philosophical viewpoint that more the state of war by Hobbes rather than sort of noble savage by Rousseau. That the default state is violence and institutions civilize us, versus the default state is egalitarianism and institutions corrupt us.
I think that, to view institutions as purely corrupting is to neglect how helpless we are as creatures when we're born into the world, right? As infants, we're shaped profoundly by our society and can't help but exist in a society. We as individuals perhaps can transform it, but we're always in dialogue. So neither the noble savage nor the Hobbesian view quite captures it. I think there is a constructive, positive vision for institutions. And I think this was perhaps better understood by previous societies. I think it's fair to say that, when you read Plato's Republic, a book sometimes people argue should be translated Plato's Regime, he is as concerned with the psychology of the people in the state as he is by how the city-state should function. And I think this profound way in which citizens are shaped by the polities they live in, that's where I would throw my chips in. So this kind of view where human nature expresses itself differently in different societies.
So is it arguing for more of a nurture over nature, or is it not really taking a stance on sort of the nurture nature
Well, I certainly have opinions. I think almost everyone has opinions on that topic. I would say that there is such a thing as a human nature, but it has a fairly diverse set of expressions. After all, a tiger in the wild and a tiger in captivity are going to display very different behaviors. Lions can, of course, be trained to perform in the circus if we disregard the ethical implications of it. And while humans perhaps are happier in some other arrangements, there's certainly, material benefits to being trained to perform in, not the circus, but the economy as it exists today. So I would say that the better view is that we come with hardware that has its very real limitations, perhaps even some pre-installed software, but we can definitely hack a lot of different cultures on top of it.
Yeah. And so why are so many institutions broken, and what separates institutions who flourish from ones who are broken or decay?
Right. Flourishing institutions, I would argue, are functional institutions. So this means that they fulfill their given purpose. They also tend to be adaptive. So I believe that, automated processes can't really process information the way human beings can. So if you have this purely bureaucratic system where people are collecting records, such as might exist in an organization like the IRS, perhaps it's a well-functioning machine. But without key individuals that have the ability to transform and reform such an organization, it can't truly be adaptive and change to differing circumstances. So I think that when civilizational failure has occurred in the past, it was because either the automated structure, these big, bureaucratic structures, be it, say, the Catholic Church at one point in medieval history, or be it something like the IRS, they either broke down from lack of maintenance, or they were functioning as designed, but their environment transformed. So I think to have flourishing institutions, you need to have flourishing people. You need to have individuals who understand the actual social fabric of the working of an organization. By this, I mean how things get done. We all have this very rich tacit knowledge when we work in our own professional environment, but often have these very vague, imprecise thoughts about different domains of society where we just take the face value descriptions and run with them. Everyone's environment's quite information rich. I know of no organization where the written description of the organization and how it actually works are the same thing. And I've yet to hear a satisfying description of human social life, right? In other words, the task of anthropology, that's to, study human beings as such, is incomplete. So as we operate with imperfect knowledge and we try to understand the world around us, those of us who are a little bit more successful at this task of understanding can build and redirect institutions so that they can adapt to any sort of changing circumstance that might arise. And, the historical evidence for this is quite solid. You have these states that overcome events like massive climate change, such as drought and so on. They might undertake new irrigation projects, or they might compensate that irrigation is no longer viable by, conquering new lands, or they might set up a system of grain storage. The difference between, a society or a civilization that fails because of natural resource constraints and the ones that succeed is often this adaptability to the changing parameters of both natural and the geopolitical world around them.
You're squarely in the great founder theory camp. You have a whole manuscript called Great Founder Theory, as opposed to the technological determinism camp. Does that imply that if Steve Jobs hadn't built Apple, someone else might not have made the iPhone, or does it apply something different? And what are the implications of being in that camp?
That's a very interesting question. I think certain kinds of technological change are overdetermined given their context. But I think one of the clean distinctions we have to make is one of invention and adoption, right? You might have an invention of the steam engine by Heron of Alexandria in the 2nd century BC, but the steam engine is only massively adopted with the 18th century with Watt's steam engine and several others. So technologies and their potential, they might always be there, but societies will respond differently. So I think founders don't necessarily transform society as a whole on the technological dimension, but they certainly need to know how to read society. So when we have the invention of the printing press in China and in Europe, Well, China has nothing like the Protestant Reformation, and the Protestant Reformation does kick off in China. I think that with the iPhone in particular, it was a brilliant leap that easily might have been decades in the future before someone found that sort of product. If you think about it, the brilliance is in teaching the users what they wanted. No one was really asking for the kind of device Steve Jobs built. No one was expecting it, right? They were expecting miniaturized, specialized devices closer to iPods than iPhones.
When you talk about great founder theory, you talk about people like Steve Jobs, but also political and governmental leaders. How should we, when you think about flourishing institutions, how should we think about the differences between what makes companies flourish and what makes governments flourish, and the overlaps? And how similar or different should we think about those?
Well, I think there's a wide spectrum of institutions besides just technological and governmental. But since you put emphasis on these two, I think a good thing to remember is that at one point, all governments are a certain kind of startup. America's founding goes down to about 300 people gathering in Philadelphia in the Constitutional Convention, or perhaps an even smaller group of delegates from various states gathering and reaching the decision that independence is the right course of action. That actually happens on July 2nd, not July 4th. July 4th is just when independence is announced. I think that the analogy strongly works in situations like that of Singapore, where you start off with low state capacity, so few bureaucracies. In that sort of situation, you might have, a founder archetype like Lee Kuan Yew, or for a more recent example, I think in Rwanda, Paul Kagame can easily be understood to be, sort of a founding father of that country. Or in America's context, I think the founding fathers did actually end up determining, for better or worse, this sort of broad outlines of what's going to happen. But much as with a company, right? After the founders depart, their machinery is built. They don't necessarily foresee the full consequences of that machinery. I do think that even, in the 20th century and even now, in 2019, when the state capacity was higher, when objects like the IRS, the Pentagon, NASA had already been built, there was still room to build new ones. The best example is this sort of, the best example is perhaps NASA itself, or even the FBI itself. The FBI comes into existence basically because of the strong lobbying of J. Hoover, who wants to create a police force that crosses state lines and uses a multifaceted PR campaign using the concept of forensics as an argumentation for why local police forces that lack such laboratories can't possibly rise to the challenge of organized crime, a challenge that exists in the 1930s. This is a justification that, we as a culture have fully accepted. In 2019, we watch shows like CSI, and we can't imagine a world where the concept of scientific crime solving isn't integrated into our concept of justice. But that world existed just 80 or 90 years ago, at a time when airplanes were already flying and cars were driving on the street and people were listening to radio. The innovation in government must necessarily also be cultural innovation. You create mandate for a new kind of service, a new kind of endeavor that is for the public good. You make it so that the public optics of this endeavor are positive, and you find concrete political and social services you can provide to other governmental actors so they don't block it. So you can start with a situation where you have a small team of private individuals all the way to becoming the head of your own organization. An interesting example here, a second one to follow up the FBI example, is that of NASA and von Neumann, who immediately after World War II is, a glorified prisoner of war. He was designing the V-2 rockets for the Nazis before 1945, is brought over for Operation Paperclip, engages in what's essentially dead-end research for the US Navy, but partners up with Walt Disney to make an animated film called Man in Space. This is the start of his great PR campaign to pursue his real dream. His real dream was never creating weapons of war. It's just what paid the bills. What he wanted to do was go to space. And eventually he got to, and he was the first director of NASA. Eisenhower eventually even showed that film to his White House staff to get them on board for the political agenda of creating NASA. Now, sure, Von Braun had to come in at the right time and the right place. Missile research is dual-use technology, so it was possible to develop civilian rockets that send men to the moon, and they send a very strong signal to the Soviet Union. If need be, we could deliver nuclear warheads to the Soviet Union. Our rockets are just that good. But without his intervention, we probably would not have had a civilian space agency. We probably would have had only a military space program.
You mentioned Singapore. For a certain segment of the Charter City movement, they sort of have this view that democracy is sort of inherently corrupt or inherently dysfunctional, I should say, and that the utopia is hundreds or thousands of city-states, of Singapore is basically, of different governments with different CEOs, sort of competitive governance and the ease to exit and alternate between the one that works best for you. Do you sympathize with that as utopia? Or how do you sort of respond to that idea?
I certainly think, and this is hardly controversial, that there are well and poorly functioning democracies around the world. I think we should always focus first on what is the quality of life and what is the quality of societal achievement by a given society, by a given form of government, and only secondarily wonder whether this fits some ideological ideal. Even in the communist world, this isn't less well known today since the Cold War has ended. There were massive differences in quality of life between places such as East Germany or Yugoslavia or North Korea. Some are worse than others. Now, whether we think of things in a democratic or dictatorial fashion, there's this vast array of possible state formations that might come into existence. Looking at the United States today, it's clear that it has both democratic and non-democratic elements in its constitution. And by this, I actually mean not only the written document. The word constitution was originally used in political science and theory to describe the actual structure of power and governance of a given society. So when Aristotle, in the 4th century, is writing a treatise called the Constitution of Athens, he's not being proscriptive, he's being descriptive. He is making a big case study to understand Athenian politics and describe them as best as possible, and how this impacts the quality of life, the aspirations of the citizens, and how this impacts the ability of Athens as a society to achieve desirable outcomes. I would say that there are systems we would not call democratic that, of course, also still have democratic elements in them. Arguably, all regimes require at least some democratic elements. At the end of the day, if the people, all the people, truly don't support your regime, how can it possibly stand? But there are certainly some regimes we would not call democratic according to normal criteria that I think are functional governments, that are good places to live, and that perhaps we should learn from.
But what are some things we should learn?
For the example of Singapore in particular, I think we underestimate the value of long-term thinking combined with brilliant vision. I think we are too interested in process controls. There's a discussion that government stalemate and the sort of do-nothing Congress are features rather than bugs. People are so worried about the negative outlier. And, some people might see Trump as that outlier. There were people arguing Obama was that negative outlier, though I think that's clearly not panned out. But I feel we have not paid enough attention to the positive potential of human organizations is best expressed by its positive outliers. And if you produce a system that by design constrains individuals and constrains humans, you have cut out that positive potential as much as you might have cut out the negative potential. So I think Singapore works great because there was a Lee Kuan Yew around. If there was not a Lee Kuan Yew around, the authoritarian government might have been very, very negative. It might have ended up squandering some of Singapore's good advantages and natural advantages. But let's remember, when Singapore started off, its GDP per capita was lower than that of Jamaica. Today, Jamaica is a wonderful place to visit. It's a nice Caribbean country, but it's not a first world country. Of the states, of post-colonial states, Singapore is the only country to have traveled from third world to first. That's a remarkable achievement. And if we only endorse systems of government and sort of these kind of overly strict limitations on what you can and cannot do while in government, we will cut out the positive potentialities of those kinds of transition to our own detriment.
And what is the main attractant if you were optimizing or starting a new city or country, or trying to make an existing city or country most attractive to the highest potential, to the outliers, as you put it? What brings them? I think you, in one of your interviews, you mentioned something that people don't think about a lot, which is fun, or ways for them to meet, more of each other. Or how do you think about those qualities that bring those folks?
Right. One way to think about a city is that a city has a user experience, but the, sad or maybe realistic or possibly inspiring fact is the user experience of all the residents of a city does not matter equally. The city might, for example, be quite well optimized for the lives of those working in the financial industry. A city might be very well optimized for those working in politics. If you're thinking of a city like DC, right, Washington, DC, public infrastructure that's nominally serving millions of people might be designed a certain way to, say, make the trip from the financial district to the airport as fast as possible, even at notable public expense. Those sorts of minor details add up and help produce in various cities these very strong network effects. You want peers, people with who you exchange ideas, who you can create a viable subculture, a space that makes your work as easy as possible. And since a single city can only optimize for so many things, there are going to be a small number of globally relevant cities, and competition is going to be quite harsh. The people of the very highest talent have been very mobile long before the age of jet travel or even the age of rail. In medieval Europe or medieval China, people would move hundreds or thousands of miles to pursue specialized education or special economic or political opportunities. The higher your social capital, the more mobile you tend to be. The easier it is to pay the cost of uprooting yourself and moving somewhere else. Now, of course, sometimes moves can also be driven by desperation, but generally speaking, there's only a small number of cities in any given era that truly attract the most interesting people of their time. Ancient Greek Alexandria, London of the 18th century, New York of the middle of the 20th century, and arguably of all the world cities, San Francisco right now still seems the biggest magnet for talent. We'll see how long that persists. Many things are flawed about the city, but ultimately the user experience of people who want to innovate in technology is still higher here, despite all the drawbacks, than almost anywhere else.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at eric@turpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.
If you did design a city for outliers, or if you were explicit about it, it seems that would, be very controversial, because we are sort of steeped in egalitarianism, naturally, culturally. And why are we steeped in egalitarianism naturally and culturally, do you think?
I think a very strong reason for that is that our politics are politics of scale, that were designed and operated in an era where it became possible to mobilize large armies, right? And you had these notable conscription-based armies emerging first in the 19th century. In such a context, you need the social technology and propaganda to tell people, you're not fighting this war for, the interests of a petty monarch. You're actually fighting this for the interests of your nation, which, if you think about it, is really your own self-interest. How true this story is dubious. But whether it be war or accepting higher rates of taxation, I think we've come to be made to believe that the government serves us rather than we are resources that are disposed by the government. This is, if anything, the sort of critical view that we give when we study foreign autocracies, though even these autocracies today consider themselves ultimately in the service of the people. If you look at North Korea, it's called the People's Republic of North Korea. If you analyze North Korea, it seems very obvious that North Korean citizens are not even treated very well, but are resources for the government to deploy one way or another. They, of course, impose some constraints on the system, but they don't really set the agenda of the country, its big socio-political or economic decisions. I would argue the US is more similar to this than is usually perceived. I would argue that, the story of egalitarianism we have is better and more realistic than the North Korean one, but it's just as false. And that ultimately it's a control mechanism.
What would it look like to be true?
That's a fascinating question. This also almost enters the realm of science fiction, right? Because as far as we can tell, almost all human societies have had a certain kind of elite. It's only a question of the composition of this elite and its relation to the rest of society and the relevant worldview and institutions they built. But if we had a country that was responsive or truly egalitarian, I think for starters, you would see more economic redistribution, which might or might not be good for the economy. It really depends where and how you redistribute, but I'm going to say it would be relatively bad for prosperity. It would be relatively good for cultural expression and differentiation. There wouldn't be these strong concentrations of cultural power, right? And if you think about it, in a truly democratic society, Hollywood doesn't really exist, right? It would be very strange for there to be someone who's a famous actor known by 50 million people. That doesn't seem very, equally distributed. It's not very local. It's not very in people's control. Ultimately, people don't have much of a say in what a, Hollywood movie looks like. It's more a matter of market research and economic considerations and sometimes the cultural biases there. So if you think of things like Hollywood, things like Harvard University, things like the US government itself, all of these structures would be radically more participatory, radically more ad hoc, much less vertically integrated, operating at much smaller scales, because the coordination overhead in an egalitarian structure is just so much higher. So a truly egalitarian structure actually imposes great difficulties in coordinating 300 million people, which is about the current population of the US. If you think about it, getting 3 people to agree is difficult, but doable. Getting 3 people to agree on everything, extremely difficult. Getting 300 people seems almost impossible. How in the world would you get 300 million people to agree to, invade Iraq or start a trade war or perhaps try to impose carbon taxes on the planet? You could never do such a thing. Now, maybe the argument is we shouldn't do such things. But again, I like to point to the counterexamples, successes in public health, such as the extermination of malaria in Southern Europe, hopefully other parts of the world as well eventually, or things such as the Apollo missions. It seems human coordination can do wonderful things for humanity, so we should try to pursue it.
And it is interesting when we talk about equality and redistribution, equality of opportunity, it's really about money and income and wealth and economics, but not really about status. Like, I don't know, we don't really talk about redistributing status in the same way, at least not explicitly, right?
Yeah, we tend not to think about it, even though arguably status is one of the things we want, perhaps even more than money. We certainly know of the concept of conspicuous consumption. That's when you buy the nicest car in the neighborhood or try to buy very expensive clothing. What you're doing there is straightforwardly trading money for standing, for social regard and status. So it seems to be on some level, there are many people who pursue money primarily to gain status. If you try to only redistribute material resources, but weren't redistributing status in some strange social engineered structure, you wouldn't end up satisfying people that much, I think. The typical human being doesn't need that much. You need a home, you need food, you need safe drinking water, air. And after that, most of the material goods we try to acquire, for which we work so hard, they're ultimately proxies and tools we use to achieve social ends. So if you achieve an equality of tools, But in inequality of social ends, people will be just as dissatisfied with that inequality as they are with current material inequality.
And for cultures or societies that are much poorer than us or the US that are happier, is it because they're more egalitarian when it comes to status, or they've redistributed it, or there's less inequality, or how should we think about that?
Well, we have to be very careful with measures of happiness. People, for example, like to give Scandinavian societies as a positive example, as something to emulate. But, the reports on life satisfaction differ radically between Denmark and Sweden, even though to our eyes they seem, quite comparable societies. I'm also going to point out that first world countries currently have a notably higher rate of diagnosed mental illnesses than many third world countries. This might simply be because we can now afford to diagnose mental illness, things like depression, that often have these consequences, such as the opioid addiction crisis in the US. But it could also be that human happiness is an elusive beast, not easily captured by broad economic or industrial indicators. If you give everyone a car, that might make people happy for a little bit. But then social life changes in response to the car. Maybe perhaps they now have to endure long commutes. Perhaps you can make the commutes less miserable by having them listen to podcasts and so on. But there is, I think, a complexity to social life that is very hard to reduce to a single one-fits-all formula. So I think industrial society, because industry, again, we talked about the difference between innovation and adoption. Industry is not invention. Industry is adoption. A single factory might supply the entire planet with goods, or if it doesn't supply the entire planet, there might be a single factory that supplies all of the US with a certain good. I think the number of CPU foundries around the world is probably about a dozen. These are objects that produce things at scale. The Industrial Revolution was a revolution of scale, but if happiness as such is subtle, subjective, differentiated, tied to your local social environment, that cannot be mass produced.
When we talk about the root of, I don't say envy, but a need for equality, do you sympathize with the Girardian explanation of sort of mimetic desire, and then I guess also subsequent scapegoating, where humans don't do things because of their intrinsic worth, they value them because others value them, and the more people at the same values, the more they become alike, the more vicious the rivalry, and the cycle escalates until there's chaos and the sort of guilt hot potato that in order for people to restore order, they have to sacrifice someone, a scapegoat.
I think the Girardian cycle describes a real social phenomena, but I think Girard overreaches this in proposing this as the main driving dynamic of humanity. To me, it seems one of the games people do in fact play. You can get rid of a lot of social stress by simply attributing all of the social interpersonal ills people have accumulated over decades of personal conflict to this magical cause, to a witch or a warlock or the heretic. But this is just one existing social technology that unfortunately plays out in society. There are other social technologies we might use, and which factors dominate in these dynamics, again, depends on the specifics of a given society. I think that in a society of mass consumption, where we try to all compete for a mass audience, the Girardian explanation is more powerful than in a more differentiated society that had lower political participation or lower consumerism. I think in those societies, different dynamics would dominate. If you look at the dynamics of the Chinese Communist Party, I think they are not Girardian dynamics of hunting scapegoats, though of course that is occasionally used in things like show trials and so on. The dominant dynamic is one of patronage, where you have an official that is protecting younger officials, grooming them to fill positions. Once those positions are filled, they still owe favors, and they owe their connections to the more senior official. So the senior official, by distributing jobs and sometimes material resources, has become more powerful than their nominal title might suggest. And then they might try to build a simple coalition to, in a party committee vote, get themselves promoted to a higher position, perhaps all the way to the top one that was so skillfully reached by Xi through decades of such politicking. These dynamics aren't easily reducible to each other. So I think I would disagree with scapegoating as the fundamental dynamic, but I would warmly recommend Girard's work to people for reading and thought.
What is your best explanation, biological or otherwise, for why it seems people would rather be poor but equal or egalitarian rather than richer but have vast inequalities?
There are several dynamics here. I think the first one is people like victory. So I think people cheer on inequality where it seems like they can be part of the winning team, and cheer on equality when it seems like they can be part of the winning team. So it's something perhaps very simple, some sort of dominance dynamic. There are many of us, few of you. The few can easily be defeated by the many. So would go this very, basic intuition we all share. But the other one is perhaps something like we crave social relations where it seems to us that we personally can affiliate with the highest status individuals. Ideally, we want to be them, but when that's not possible, we try to gain the favor of the popular ones. I think that egalitarianism is usually, in a political context, a tool where we can try to sort of reduce one inequality in order to get the political fuel to build a new one. Again, the history of revolution, I'm afraid, backs me up on this, where in the aftermath of the French Revolution, it didn't take long for a committee of public safety to establish a rule far more tyrannical than that of Louis XIV. And soon after the committee of public safety, Napoleon is crowned emperor. So much for undermining of hierarchy. I think egalitarianism is often a call to attack the previous status hierarchy. And on a basic biological level, we don't ever expect the status hierarchies to go away. So we attack hierarchy because the hope is that once this hierarchy is torn down on the level playing field, we will be able to establish a new hierarchy that favors us more.
The question is, how would you make the idea that we should prioritize outliers because they, create most of the wealth or most of the benefits for society? How would you make that palatable for mass audience, or would you do sort of indirectly? Because justice and egalitarianism seem, Martin Luther King, et cetera, all these leaders, it seemed much more inspiring than sort of prosperity. Like prosperity seems harder to internalize because maybe we're not wired to think on that sort of macro coordination level versus a more communal, tribal egalitarian level. How would you make that palatable, or would you just try to disguise it? Like Tyler Cowen favors promoting economic growth via promoting Mormonism, religion. So he sort of disguises it that way.
Well, I would say that I don't think you necessarily have to disguise it. You have to make the process of creation and the legitimacy of creation very, very legible. So this is in a way in which I think that, almost, the cult or the myth of Steve Jobs notably helped legitimize a large new cohort of founders. So I think straightforwardly, they become the sort of like symbols of positive, productive, pro-social outliers. If the only story we have for why someone might be exceptional is that they are depriving others of opportunity, rather than someone is exceptional, they reach for all of us, for humanity as a whole, opportunities that otherwise couldn't be reached. If you only have the first story but not the second one, you have a very hostile environment. It's very hard to justify exceptional achievement. But if you have the second one, a cultural image and understanding that more so than a straightforward box-to-box equality, what we should be searching for is a universalized flourishing of human beings. And the flourishing of human beings ends up looking notably different individual to individual. And some of the individuals will write exceptional symphonies, and other individuals might become very good runners. Other individuals still might become very good at understanding the industrial process, very good at designing new factories, and so on. This understanding of a common humanity and a desire for the flourishing of all of humanity, together with the understanding of the vitality of the productivity of outlier individuals for human flourishing, I think that allows us to sort of square the circle. This allows us to bypass a lot of destructive tendencies that might be envy driven and pursue positive outcomes. Let's remember, after all, societies can combine this in creative ways. We might think of, for example, Sweden as a relatively more egalitarian society compared to the US, but it's also home of the Nobel Prize, a prize explicitly designed to set people apart, to set exceptional scientists apart from merely normal scientists, to try to reward such behavior.
Yeah, one thing you write about it is theories of history and why it's so difficult to have coherent theories of history. Now, most people sort of, or coherent universal theories of history. Sort of intro to that. What's your most simplified version for why Obama won and then why Trump won? And to some extent, were these inevitable, or do you not see it that way?
I think neither victory was inevitable. I think both victories were driven to a significant extent by two personalities that took very different approaches to social media. I think today, we almost blame social media for the victory of Trump. Well, people were praising social media for Obama's victory. Certainly, they used social media radically differently. And even if social media didn't exist, they might have still found the right political opportunities to succeed. I think that theories of history are difficult because they're difficult to get right, because you can't examine many counterfactual cases. You have to find analogous cases throughout the historical record and decide which of these are actually analogous, which are not analogous. But nearly everyone, when they examine their motivation for action or when they try to justify their actions to others, will invoke an implicit theory of history. So we all have them. We all believe that, ultimately human politics doesn't matter. What truly matters is, the advancement of technology. Or on the other hand, someone might be, the material advancement of society doesn't truly matter. What actually matters is, our spiritual fulfillment or, social justice of a certain kind and social progress. And social progress, you mentioned Martin Luther King earlier. He has this nice quote, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's a theory of history. I'm not saying it's correct. I'm not saying it's incorrect. But nearly all of these exceptional outliers have a belief in the historicity of their work very viscerally. And almost all individuals, everyday people, when we think about the world, we to ourselves invoke history. We tell ourselves stories such as, climate change is extremely important. Whenever you've had massive climatic change in the history of the world, civilizations have tended to fall, right? Like you can't, societies can collapse in response to environmental shocks. We don't want our society to collapse. So people make these arguments either explicitly, implicitly, and they drive actions. Which theories of history are widely believed has massive impact, especially for the behavior of intellectuals, for the behavior of elites, but also for the behavior of people at scale. A good example of this might be the relative popularity of Marxism among early 20th century intellectuals. This had many downstream consequences, such as it became relatively easy for the Soviet Union to find spies in the Manhattan Project, allowing the Soviet Union to acquire the blueprints for America's superweapon almost immediately after the war. But, you also have things such as the rise of Christianity altering Roman elites forever, or the popularity of Protestant arguments among European nobility, resulting in, a split between Northern and Southern Europe. These theories can be changed. And I think it's not, however, the case that all of them are equally valid. I think something like a scientific understanding of human societies is possible. We've not reached it yet. Well, once we do, and even before we do, these theories are not all equally correct or incorrect. Theories that are closer to the actual structure of reality, or that can be used to mobilize more people or a higher quality people, these theories of history shape the course of history itself.
And do you have a quick view on the Martin Luther King theory of history, and zooming out, what is the best version of history that we have, or the one that you are most sympathetic to?
I'm skeptical of moral progress as an automatic process. What I believe is different civilizations and societies have different moral values. and they can work out these values closer and closer to their societal ideal over time until they collapse. Whether in the big picture, the universe itself is driving towards objective morality seems almost outside the scope of human history, right? It would be then as true of quarks and stars as it would be of human beings. So I feel that's almost making a metaphysical claim. I think at this point we have to remember Martin Luther King, was a Protestant Christian, perhaps a liberal Protestant Christian, but he was a Christian. So his statement is straightforwardly a religious statement. I think I would be more of a kind of polytheist and would say that there are many very powerful value systems that can come to perfect themselves over time, and that they organize human societies, values, cognition differently. And we are currently living in a contingent rather than necessary civilization. And if we want, our current set of, values, goals, aspirations to last, we should probably see to it that our world system, our civilization lasts, because the next one is unlikely to value the same things.
It seems that the dominant theory that has taken hearts and minds today and for the last while is progressivism, and that's come from the Whigs in the 18th century, which basically is egalitarian values and democratic governments, not just as the moral beacon, but also as the most effective type of governments. And there's this movement, very small fringe movement called neo-reactionary movement, also called the Dark Enlightenment. Maybe you're familiar with them. That is sort of says that democracy is not the most effective style of government. That things should look more like Singapore, and it's also not clear that it's the most moral form. And the big implication here is that the progressive movement sort of ascribes to the mistake theory, the mistake versus conflict theory, which is the mistake theory says that the conflict that we have mostly results because we don't either have the right knowledge or we don't have the right resources to just get along. But if we had the right resources or knowledge, we would all get along. Whereas conflict theory says we have, just conflict is zero sum. We fight over resources, and the truth is that's the truth. And so we shouldn't prioritize the truth, or we'll just, have more conflict. And the goal is to kind of disguise that things are all zero sum because conflict is inherent. How would you respond to my wording of that duality and to the ideas therein?
Well, I think there have been, in the early internet, there was a flourishing of alternative thinking in all sorts of interesting directions. I think, characterizing this view of progress as being, central to the development of our society, I do think this is the dominant worldview, and, has been for at least the last 80 to 90 years, even predating World War II. Arguably, World War II is a deviation from that trend. But I think that the reality is that the world is not purely positive sum, but it's also not purely negative sum. I think mixed sum describes the world, including our social life, the best. After all, the very best way to be prepared for a negative sum conflict, like, possibly war or business competition, is to spend most of your time playing positive sum games, such as economic development, right? Prepares you and sets you up for war much better. Sometimes butter doesn't just make you fat, it makes you, strong, prepared, and have a well-functioning economy come times of war. Or, in a business context, if you're hyper competitive in the market, perhaps this is good. But if you're hyper competitive at the workplace, you might just end up destroying workplace culture. So the true challenge, I think, is balancing this so that it's appropriate to the situation, so that you can easily, smoothly adapt from the positive sum game to a more negative sum environment if that arises, or to rise from a negative sum environment to create islands of positive sum, because that positive sum produces ultimately the resources that keep you safe or allow you to defeat negative sum situations. I think that, there's democracy has so far stood several decades of a kind of test of history, though what we mean by the word democracy has, of course, changed massively over 200 years. That's why I say a few decades. I think 20th century societies and states and governments, because of mass media implementing the political agendas of these very powerful people, be they Walt Disney or, some less savory users of mass media, can't really be straightforwardly compared to 18th century societies. They exist at a notably higher level of state capacity. And again, many awful things can be done in the name of democracy. As perhaps we learned in the early 21st century, I don't tend to comment much on politics, but I'm going to say, the Iraq War was clearly just a pointless waste of lives and funds. It didn't advance American geopolitical interests well. It did not advance Iraqi interests very well. It should discredit at least the axiomatic view that we should expect a democracy hiding under every tyrant's boot. You remove the tyrant's boot, then there's going to be a democracy flourishing. I think that view certainly has to be discredited, and it can lead to a lot of suffering. But that's foreign policy. Domestically, economically, technologically, democracy has both positives and negatives. Positives would be that in a democracy, it's very easy to make the argument for mass consumerism, whether we like it or not. Mass consumerism is what enables centralized production in factories to be economical, right? For every Tesla that rolls out of a Tesla factory, for every machine of that kind, for every car on the assembly line, there are 50 to 100 machines, each as complicated as that one car. It would never make sense to build a factory to build a single car. It only makes sense to build a factory to build 1 million cars. That's what recuperates the initial investment on those much more complicated machines. And of course, those machines are themselves produced in factories, and eventually it bottoms out in relatively small workshops. But in a way, democracy and industrialization were natural partners, especially if you consider that, perhaps there are some structural similarities between fascism, democracy, and communism, all of them being mass political movements. In a real way, however, we live in a post-industrial society, and I think it remains to be discovered what the most natural political partner to post-industrial economies of attention and scale are. They might end up looking notably different, not just than the United States, but notably different from China, which is often set up as this, future alternative to the US, and certainly, seems to have some strong advantages over the US.
Peter Thiel had this podcast with Erik Weinstein yesterday where he talked about, he had this quote that the president is like the mayor of the US, but like the dictator of the world. And so foreign policy is certainly the most powerful person in the world. So foreign policy is really where a US president can have a lot of leverage. Given that, or if you agree with that, what would your recommendation for US foreign policy be moving forward? And I'm curious, looking back, if you think any of the wars of the last 100 years made sense, if you would have done them again.
I think that a lot of restraint makes sense. I think some of the wars have made sense. It can be very difficult to tell which ones. Again, counterfactuals are difficult. I think arguably the US did have vital geopolitical interests in intervening in Europe during World War II. I think arguably some aspects of containment policy made sense, especially in the European context and the Middle Eastern contexts. I think in the Asian context, they didn't matter much. So, it's an interesting question. I think the Korean War probably ultimately was not worth fighting. Obviously, Vietnam was probably not worth fighting. I think probably guaranteeing Taiwan was worthwhile for when it lasted. It's interesting that the foreign policy can be so capricious, right? You would assume that this would be treated with some sort of trepidation where we would try to lock up the international dimension more so as to have a country that is capable of making and keeping commitments, regardless of what the political winds happen to be at a particular time, with low capriciousness, with a reluctance to go to war except under extreme necessity, and to rather have a government that can, easily work domestically. So my recommendation would be perhaps enhance presidential power at home and disperse it abroad.
And you mentioned China has some strengths relative to US. What's going to determine whether US or China, pulls ahead in the next, decades? And would your advice also be restraint for China?
I think for China, it has the very difficult problem of needing to not provoke the United States, where the United States is provocable, but in a not very clear pattern. I think any sort of military conflict for the foreseeable future in, say, the Indian Ocean or East Africa or Southeast Asia is one that China is relatively likely to lose. I'm here positing a limited war, the equivalent of bombing runs or some ships fighting. I don't actually expect anyone would go for a full war between the two sides. I think that China's key challenges will probably rest in they will run out of possible sources of growth. And they as a society seem to be as dependent on the promise of growth as Western society is. And the US, all things considered, still has an advantage in innovation. There are a few niche areas where China might pull ahead, such as biotechnology. Again, in particular, because of different values in Chinese society, the concept of, say, genetically engineering humans for higher intelligence will be more acceptable there than it is here. So if that pans out, they might find, their killer application. But in the absence of such niche areas where we have greater difficulty pursuing better technology, I think the US is better positioned for growth. And so, what happens is there is a sphere of interest around China, probably East Asia, probably Southeast Asia, probably East Africa. But the US also has its sphere of influence, and it's probably in Western Europe and Latin America, in parts of the Middle East. And these two relatively large blocks reach a new equilibrium. So one shifted towards China 1 or 2 degrees, rather than a world where China is as dominant as the US was, say, 10 or 20 years ago. So I think it's going to be a kind of a bipolar world order for a while to come.
So I posit, and I'm curious if you agree, that what's a lot of what's going to determine the winner is each country's ability to have technological innovation and thus economic growth. And Peter Thiel has this view that since the 1970s or so, we've stagnated significantly, not just the economy, but also our ambitions. So both for cultural and structural reasons, we're in a much worse place from an technological growth and innovation perspective. I'm curious broadly if you agree with that view. He also has the view that there's sort of a globalization versus innovation axis, that sort of innovation is from 0 to 1 and globalization is just copying. And so those are a bit at odds, and we're in a globalization era, but not in an innovation era. I'm curious if you agree with that. And I'm curious broadly where you might differ from Peter Thiel, if at all.
I think that the history of transport technology shows that technologies are centralizing forces. Let me explain what I mean by centralization. As soon as you have faster travel, more can be done in a single place. So this means that you've transformed, perhaps a county into a city, and eventually you transform a country into a single city, and eventually transform the world into a single city or a single village. I think that if we have technological innovation, the result will be yes and yes. Technological innovation will, as a necessary consequence, lead to more globalization, since I think technology is inherently centralizing and centralization thrives at scale. I do agree that globalization as such cuts against innovation. So perhaps what we have is a self-extinguishing process, not so much the exponential curve occurs while, but the S curve of diminishing returns to complexity, perhaps closer to something like Tainter's model. So my view would be that we will have a retreat from globalization, followed by some flurry of new local innovation, eventually followed by a new era of globalization.
So does that mean that the world gets more decentralized over time? And I'm curious, Peter Thiel also frames that as centralizing for being AI and decentralized force being sort of the crypto movement. And if you look at some of our problems as a species today, nuclear proliferation, AI, climate change, these are global problems requiring sort of global governance or global coordination. So I'm curious if you think the future is more decentralized or centralized, and how that plays out.
Oh, I think I'm a little bit of a heretic, especially in Silicon Valley. I think the future is much more centralized. And I think the reason is because information technology in particular has made the world much more legible. And especially bureaucratic legibility lends itself to taking things out of the hands of humans and giving these things in the hands of processes. Processes have unlimited attention. Humans have limited attention. Therefore, eventually, most information processing becomes central. And once you've done that, once the advantage of local knowledge is obliterated, at that point, there's only the raw economy of industrial scale, and then you want to scale it as much as possible.
One thing you write a lot about is the succession problem. If you're trying to maximize the number of outliers, it seems that wealthy people have less kids on average. And if you think that there's some correlation between wealth and likelihood of outliers, do you think that we should care about the total fertility rate?
Oh, interesting. I think we underestimate the value of family experience and dynasties in particular. We have pseudo-political dynasties. We have also scientific dynasties. Say Charles Darwin, of all people, ironically came from a family of high achievers. Now, whether this is nature or nurture doesn't matter that much, but it is true that I think if exceptional people don't end up having children, they don't end up thinking of the problems that parents who have children might have, and they won't think about what's necessary for the human replenishment of society. So I think it's important for societies to have above replacement fertility, so to have like a structurally healthy society so that the old don't come to dominate societal agendas too much. And I think it's important as a consequence for elites to have at least some experience living with children to take these considerations into account. And then as a side benefit, because they have children, these children are disproportionately likely due to their life opportunities to perhaps become highly skilled. Now, of course, you have to balance this where you might have a success of transferring wealth or power without a success of transferring skill or responsibility. And I would consider those succession failures. That's why I've explored interesting models such as the ones used by the 5 good emperors in the Roman Empire, which is a system of adoption, where you basically take a talented person who's already an adult, you adopt them, and then in the Roman context, they socially made them your child and the heir to both your name, so your brand, and your social connections, and also your property. Imagine if today we had such a legal mechanism in the US. I actually think it might be it seems strictly superior to tenure. Let's put it that way.
So last question, for your point earlier about world becoming more centralized, are you thus unsympathetic to the crypto narrative or utopia that money will become unbundled or uncoupled from state, and the sort of sovereign individual thesis of a more decentralized internet? And then in closing, for people who want to go deeper on your ideas, particularly in Silicon Valley, where most of our listeners are, what do you think a venture capital firm can most take or should most look into your ideas, or Silicon Valley at large trying to maximize innovation?
I would say that it's difficult to say whether sympathetic or non-sympathetic. I think that there are many times where I wish we had a much more decentralized society on a number of dimensions. I just don't expect it to happen, and I think we should bet accordingly. I further think that if you want to explore some of my ideas, I would recommend the essay Functional Institutions Are the Exception. That's a good place to start. And the other one is my essay on, how Roman emperors handled the succession problem. Intellectual dark matter might be a third essay that's very interesting, where I explore the unseen knowledge in society.
Samo, thank you so much for coming to this podcast. This has been a great episode. I'll put your Medium and Twitter in the show notes so people can follow along. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.